Claire Anderson had spent 18 years living in darkness. Her father, General Jack Harrison, had done everything he could to find a cure. 73 specialists from around the world,
I'm
but
Dr.
nothing
Chen. How is
worked.
she?
Then,
She
a
hasn't
rookie
spoken
nurse
since she
named
got here.
Rachel Moore entered
We're doing
the
everything
room.
we can.
She'd only been working for 6 weeks, but when she looked into Claire's eyes, she saw something
Pupil's
that
not reacting.
everyone else had missed.
Something's wrong.
With a simple tool,
What is it? What's
Rachel
wrong
did
with her?
what millions of
Her
dollars
neural
and
activity
countless
is
specialists
suppressed.
couldn't.
It's not natural.
Claire screamed, and General Harrison dropped to his knees in disbelief. The doctors around them couldn't even look him in the eye. What happens next will shock you. So, where are you watching from today?
If you're as curious as we are, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell so you can stay updated with every step of this amazing journey.
Claire Anderson had known nothing but darkness for 18 years. Each day she woke to the sound of her father's boots descending the stairs of their military home. 13 steps. He always took exactly 13 steps. It was the same every day. Her father, General Jack Harrison, had done everything to fix her. He'd flown in specialists from across the world, spent millions of dollars, all in an attempt to find a cure, but nothing worked. Claire had learned to live with it. She didn't need sight to understand the world around her. She memorized the sounds of the coffee machine in the mornings, the rhythmic tapping of her father's boots, the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Her world was built on these sounds, and every corner of their house had its own signature. She could tell where the coffee cups were, which drawer held the silverware, and which container held the sugar, all by touch and sound. Her father never stopped trying, though. His military mindset made him believe there was always a solution, always a strategy. But Claire had come to terms with her blindness long ago. Her father hadn't. His failure to restore her sight was something he couldn't let go of, and it weighed heavily on him. He tried to hide it, but Claire could always sense it in his voice, in his posture, in the way he paused at the door every morning to make sure she was okay before he stepped into his day. "Morning, Sharon," he'd always say, using her childhood nickname. "Coffee's ready?" "Morning, Dad." "Black," she'd reply, already reaching for the mug that always sat in the same spot on the counter. Her fingers brushed the smooth surface of the cup, the familiar warmth of it reminding her of the morning routine they'd shared for years. It was one of the few things she could count on in her otherwise unpredictable life. He sat down at the kitchen table, the chair creaking slightly as he did. He always sat in the same place, the left side of the table, his back stiff, his eyes usually scanning the room as if he were assessing potential threats. It was his way. It was how he'd lived for years, ever since he first put on a uniform. Everything about their world was orderly, predictable. Claire found comfort in it. She could feel the smooth surface of the table under her fingertips as she adjusted her tea. It was a routine that kept her grounded, kept her sane in a life that sometimes felt too chaotic to bear. "You know," her father said one morning, his voice softening as he set down his coffee mug, "I think you've made me predictable." She smiled at the remark, though he couldn't see it. "You made yourself predictable 18 years ago," she teased, a gentle jab at his tendency to follow the same routine day in and day out. "Structure prevents chaos." He chuckled. "You always were the smart one." There was a quiet pause between them. She read through her psychology journal, her fingers gliding over the raised braille dots as she absorbed the information. Claire had been working toward her psychology degree at Georgetown, completed entirely through audio lectures and tactile materials. Her professors constantly praised her as their top student, and though she was proud, she always responded with a shrug. She had fewer distractions than most students. No Instagram, no Netflix, just hours of concentrated listening. "Neuroplasticity in sensory-deprived individuals," she said aloud, quoting from the article she was reading. "Turns out my brain reorganized itself. My visual cortex now processes sound and touch. I'm basically a superhero, Dad. Just not the kind with a movie franchise." Her father's gaze lingered on her for a moment, and she could feel the weight of his stare, even if she couldn't see it. It wasn't just the gaze of a father watching his daughter, it was also the look of pride mixed with an unspeakable pain. He admired her strength, but there was a part of him that hated seeing her so independent. He wanted to fix everything for her, to make the darkness go away, but he couldn't. "You are remarkable," he said quietly. Claire paused for a moment, her fingers hovering over the braille page. She could feel his words sinking deep, touching a place she rarely let anyone see. "I'm adapted," she corrected softly, her fingers finding the next paragraph. "There's a difference. Remarkable is a choice. Adapted is just what happens when you don't have options." Her father didn't respond right away, and she knew it was because he couldn't argue with her. He had tried everything, but in his heart, he still wanted to fix things. For her. For him. There was a familiar sound of boots tapping outside as the base woke up around them. She could hear the steady hum of activity just beyond the walls of their home. Her world had boundaries, but they were hers, and she had made peace with them, even if her father never had. She finished her tea, kissed her father on the cheek, and prepared for another day in the only life she had ever known. But she had no idea that, in exactly 4 hours, her world would change forever. Rachel Moore walked into the sterile hospital room, feeling the weight of every eye on her. As a rookie nurse, she had been told to simply do her job, keep Claire comfortable, fetch supplies, and follow the instructions of the doctors. Nothing more, nothing less. She had been warned by her supervisor, Patricia Monroe, to keep her head down and her opinions to herself. "You're here to shadow, not to save the world," Patricia had said, her tone dismissive. But Rachel couldn't help it. There was something about Claire's eyes, the way they looked unfocused and distant, that made Rachel pause. The report had been clear. Claire had congenital optic nerve hypoplasia, a condition that was irreversible, with no hope of treatment. Yet, as Rachel stood beside the bed, looking at Claire's blank gaze, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. "Good morning, Claire. How are you feeling today?" Rachel asked softly, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Claire turned her head slightly in the direction of Rachel's voice, her expression unreadable. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady, but there was a hint of something in her tone, something Rachel couldn't quite place. Rachel set the tray down on the table beside Claire's bed and began adjusting the IV drip, her hands trembling slightly. It wasn't just the nerves of being new to the job. It was the growing sense that she was missing something. Or that something was wrong and no one else had seen it. Claire's father, General Jack Harrison, stood near the door, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He had been standing in the same spot for the last few minutes, watching Rachel with a guarded expression. His presence was commanding, even without a word. It was clear he was protective of his daughter, as any father would be. But there was more to it, an exhaustion, a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. Rachel felt a wave of sympathy for the man. She could sense the weight of his failures, the way he had carried the burden of not being able to help his daughter. But what Rachel also sensed, even more strongly, was that he was desperately clinging to the last shred of hope, that one day, someone, anyone, would finally be able to fix what had been broken for so long. As Rachel began checking Claire's vitals, she noticed something odd, something subtle. When she adjusted the light over Claire's bed, the way Claire's pupils reacted was not what she had expected. They dilated, yes, but there was something more. A faint translucent veil seemed to cover the surface of Claire's eyes. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. Her training told her this couldn't be right. Claire's condition, the diagnosis from 73 specialists, said the optic nerve was the problem. But what if it wasn't? What if there was something else? Rachel didn't know what it was, but the more she thought about it, the more it troubled her. This wasn't just a case of congenital blindness. There was something hidden beneath the surface, something that had gone unnoticed by everyone else. For the next hour, Rachel tried to put her suspicions out of her mind. She followed the routine, adjusted the monitors, and answered Claire's occasional questions, but her thoughts kept drifting back to those eyes. "Dad, could you step out for a moment?" Claire's voice broke through Rachel's thoughts. General Harrison looked at her for a moment, then nodded. He left the room without a word, closing the door behind him. Claire shifted slightly in her bed, turning her head toward Rachel. "You've been staring at my eyes for a while now," she said, her voice calm but direct. "What's going on?" Rachel hesitated. She had been trained to avoid being overly familiar with patients, but there was something about Claire's presence that made her want to share her thoughts. I'm not sure," Rachel admitted, her voice soft. "I think there might be something we missed. Something with your eyes. It's very subtle, but I think it's worth looking into. Claire blinked slowly, processing what Rachel had said. You think they missed something? I do. It's just a feeling, but I think you deserve to know if there's more we can do. Claire's face softened, and for the first time, Rachel saw something other than resignation. There was a flicker of hope, small, fragile, but it was there. I don't want to get my hopes up, Claire said quietly, but if you think there's a chance, I'll take it. Rachel nodded, feeling a surge of determination. She didn't know what she had found, or if she was just imagining it, but she knew one thing for certain. Claire deserved more than what the experts had given her. She deserved the truth. As Rachel left the room, she found herself standing outside the door, looking at General Harrison, who was waiting patiently. His eyes locked on hers, and for a moment, Rachel felt the weight of his expectations. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say anything, he spoke first. What did you find? He asked, his voice low but laced with hope. Rachel hesitated. I'm not sure yet, sir, but I think we need to take another look. General Harrison's face was unreadable, but his eyes softened for just a fraction of a second. Then he nodded. Do whatever you have to do, he said firmly. Just don't give up on her. The following morning, Rachel woke up with a sense of urgency she couldn't shake. She had spent the entire night reading through medical journals, trying to understand what she had seen in Claire's eyes. Epiretinal membranes. It was the term that kept swirling in her mind, a condition she had heard about only briefly during her studies, but never connected to Claire's case. She was still unsure of herself. The medical community had spent years dismissing any hope for Claire's recovery, and now Rachel was going against that very establishment. It wasn't just her career on the line. It was a life. Claire's life. Rachel walked to the hospital with her head down, lost in thought. She arrived early, the halls still quiet. Her shift didn't start for another hour, but she knew she couldn't wait. When she entered the ward, she made a beeline for the nurse's station to grab the necessary equipment. Then, with determination in her steps, she made her way to room 347. Claire was already awake, her fingers tracing patterns along the edge of the blanket. She had a calm, almost serene expression on her face, but Rachel could see the underlying tension in her posture. She was always trying to appear stronger than she felt, as though she didn't want anyone to know how much she longed for a change. Morning, Claire, Rachel greeted, setting down her medical kit on the side table. Claire turned her head toward her, as usual, without fully focusing on the nurse. Morning, she replied, her voice gentle. You seem different today. Rachel smiled softly. I'm here to help. I want to give this a real shot. Claire raised an eyebrow, her expression shifting. A real shot at what? There's nothing left to try. Rachel bit her lip, hesitant for a moment. Then she spoke with a newfound confidence. I think we've missed something all these years. There's a chance that something can still be done. Claire was quiet for a long moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. I've heard that before, she finally said, her voice tinged with doubt. I know, Rachel replied softly, moving closer to the bed. But I'm not giving up on you, Claire. I believe there's still hope. I need you to trust me. Claire seemed to consider her words for a moment. Then she nodded, albeit with some reluctance. I'm listening. Rachel took a deep breath, picking up the penlight and testing its brightness. She could feel the weight of the moment. She knew that one wrong move, one misstep, and it would all be over. But she couldn't stop now. Look straight ahead, Rachel instructed softly, adjusting the penlight in her hand. This might be a little bright. Claire obeyed, keeping her gaze fixed in front of her. Rachel carefully examined her right eye, adjusting the penlight. The light flickered, and Rachel leaned in closer, her heart racing. There it was again, the faint veil, the same translucent layer that she had seen the day before. It was there, visible now, confirming her suspicions. The veil was covering the retina, blocking the visual information from reaching the brain. It wasn't congenital optic nerve hypoplasia. This was something else entirely. Rachel didn't take her eyes off the examination, her hands shaking slightly. She moved to Claire's left eye, performing the same test, the same thing. Another translucent layer, a membrane covering the retina. Rachel stepped back, her mind racing. She had found it, She had found what no one else had seen, epiretinal membranes, and they could be removed, but she couldn't let herself celebrate yet. There was still a huge hurdle in front of her. The medical team would never believe her. They'd dismiss her as a rookie, someone who didn't know enough to challenge the diagnoses that had been made by experts. But Rachel knew what she had seen, and if she was right, this could change everything for Claire. "Claire," Rachel said, her voice a little more steady than before, "I found something. It's not what we thought." Claire turned her head, her expression confused. "What do you mean? What's wrong now?" Rachel bit her lip. "It's not about what's wrong, it's about what we can do. You don't have optic nerve hypoplasia. You have epiretinal membranes. They're covering your retinas, blocking your vision, but they can be removed." Claire's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? I don't understand." Rachel nodded, keeping her voice calm and steady. "I know this is a lot to take in, but this is real. The specialist missed it, but I'm sure of it. You don't have to live in darkness anymore. We can fix this." Claire's face went pale, her breath catching in her throat. For the first time in 18 years, there was something new, something different in her life, a possibility. But with that possibility came the weight of fear. The fear of failure, the fear that maybe this was just another false hope. Rachel placed a hand gently on Claire's shoulder. "I know you're scared. I am too. But if we do this, if you let me help you, there's a chance you can see. Really see. Not just in your mind, but with your eyes." Claire looked down at her hands, trembling slightly. "What if it doesn't work? What if I open my eyes and it's still just darkness?" Rachel kneeled down beside her, her voice soft and reassuring. "We won't know unless we try. And no matter what happens, you're not alone in this." Claire met her gaze, her eyes searching Rachel's face, looking for any sign of doubt. There was none. Rachel believed in her. And for the first time in a long while, Claire felt like she might be able to believe in herself again. The morning after Rachel's discovery, she stood in front of the door to Dr. Raymond Kellerman's office, her heart pounding in her chest. She had known this moment would come, the moment when she would have to present her findings to the medical establishment. The same establishment that had dismissed Claire's condition for years. The same doctors who would likely ridicule her for even suggesting they had missed something so fundamental. But Rachel was not backing down. She knocked on the door, and when Kellerman's voice called out, she entered. The senior ophthalmologist sat behind his desk, papers scattered in front of him. His glasses were perched on the edge of his nose, and his eyes were fixed on the stack of reports in front of him. "Doctor!" "Kellerman," Rachel began, her voice steady, but her nerves creeping into her tone. "I need to talk to you about Claire Anderson." Kellerman didn't look up at first. "What is it now, Nurse Moore? We've already had several consultations. Nothing new has changed." Rachel took a deep breath. "I found something. In Claire's eyes, something that wasn't there in the reports. It's not optic nerve hypoplasia. It's something else." At this, Kellerman finally looked up, his gaze sharp and calculating. "What are you saying? That after 73 specialists, you've discovered something new?" Rachel nodded, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Yes, epiretinal membranes. They're blocking her vision, not the optic nerve." Kellerman's expression hardened. "Nurse Moore, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but your assessment doesn't match the established diagnosis. Claire's condition is well documented. She has congenital optic nerve hypoplasia. It's irreversible. There's no need for further speculation." Rachel's chest tightened, but she refused to back down. "I'm not speculating, Dr. Kellerman. I examined her eyes myself. I've seen the layer, thin, translucent, covering both retinas. I believe it can be removed." Kellerman sighed, clearly frustrated. "You're new, Nurse Moore. I understand you want to make a name for yourself, but this isn't about proving something to others. This is about the patient's well-being. I've reviewed all the medical history. The treatment for Claire's condition is clear. She's blind, and that's the reality we have to work with." Rachel stood her ground, her voice unwavering. "I've seen it. I'm telling you, I'm sure of it. If we don't act now, Claire could be left in the dark forever." Kellerman's brow furrowed. This isn't a game, Nurse Moore. If you want to challenge a diagnosis that's been confirmed by the best, you better be prepared for the consequences. For a moment, there was silence in the room. Rachel could feel the weight of his words, but it only made her more determined. This wasn't just about being right. This was about Claire. "I'm prepared," Rachel said quietly, meeting his gaze head-on. "If I'm wrong, I'll accept the consequences. But if I'm right, Claire deserves a chance. A real chance." Kellerman stood up, his voice cold. "I'll arrange a meeting with the senior staff, but don't get your hopes up. You're suggesting something that flies in the face of every diagnosis we've received. The risks involved are enormous, and if you're wrong, it could ruin careers." Rachel didn't flinch. "I'm willing to take that risk. For Claire." The meeting had been scheduled for 2 p.m., but Rachel had arrived early, sitting alone in the conference room, her hands shaking slightly as she reviewed her notes. The tension was palpable in the sterile, white-walled room. Every so often she glanced at the door, expecting Dr. Kellerman or one of the senior staff members to walk in. The weight of what was about to happen settled heavily on her shoulders. She had no medical authority, no seniority, just a fresh perspective and a hunch that could either make or break her career. But more than that, it could change Claire's life. Rachel knew that even if she convinced Dr. Kellerman to take Claire's case seriously, there would still be resistance from the others. She had already faced skepticism, whispers behind her back, and a steady stream of dismissive glances from the senior medical staff. But none of that mattered now. She had seen something no one else had, and if it meant risking everything, she would do it. At precisely 2 o'clock, the door swung open, and Dr. Kellerman entered, followed by Dr. Morrison, another ophthalmologist from the hospital, and a few other specialists. General Jack Harrison was standing quietly by the wall, his arms crossed, a determined look on his face. The room seemed to shrink as they all gathered around the table. Rachel stood up, her palms clammy against her sides. Dr. Kellerman didn't waste any time. "Let's get this over with," he said, his voice a mixture of exhaustion and frustration. "I've reviewed Nurse Moore's findings, and I'm willing to entertain the possibility that something was missed." Kellerman began, though his tone made it clear he wasn't fully convinced. "But let's be clear. If we're going to consider this, we're talking about a massive shift in the way we approach Claire's diagnosis." "Thank you," Rachel said, trying to steady her voice. "I believe Claire's condition is not what we originally thought. It's not optic nerve hypoplasia, it's epiretinal membranes." There was a collective pause in the room. General Harrison shifted on his feet, his eyes scanning each of the doctors for some sign of agreement. Dr. Morrison, who had been quiet until now, spoke up, his voice sharp. "Epiretinal membranes?" he repeated, as if testing the word on his tongue. "You're suggesting that all of us, all 73 specialists who've seen Claire, missed something as simple as that?" Rachel nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, sir. I've seen it with my own eyes. A thin, translucent layer covering the retina. It's blocking Claire's vision, but it can be removed, and if we do this, she could regain her sight." "Doctor?" Kellerman shot her a look, his eyebrows raised. "And you're certain of this? You, a rookie nurse, think you've discovered something the world's top experts have missed for years?" Rachel didn't flinch. She stood her ground. "I'm sure, Dr. Kellerman. I may be new to this field, but I know what I saw. And Claire deserves the chance to see, even if it means going against everything that's been said." There was a long silence. The weight of the situation hung in the air, thick and heavy. General Harrison finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Are we really going to ignore the possibility that we've been wrong all this time?" he asked, his eyes meeting each of the doctors around the table. "My daughter has lived 18 years in darkness. I'm not asking for a miracle, I'm asking for a chance. I've seen Rachel's work. I trust her. If there's even the smallest chance we've missed something, I want to know." "Doctor?" Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but paused when he saw the determined look on General Harrison's face. The general had always been a man who faced battles head-on, and it was clear he wasn't backing down now. Rachel took a breath and continued. "I know this is hard to believe. I understand the risks. But if Claire has a chance to see, really see, then we need to act now. We can't afford to keep waiting and hoping for something that's not going to happen." Kellerman leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the table thoughtfully. "All right," he said finally. "We'll examine her again. But I want to be clear. If we go forward with this, we do so at great risk. There are complications involved, and I'm not convinced this is the right course of action." "I don't care about the risks," General Harrison said, his voice unwavering. "I care about my daughter having a chance at a life she deserves." The room fell silent for a moment before Dr. Kellerman sighed. "We'll re-examine Claire's eyes tomorrow morning. If what you're saying is true, we'll schedule the procedure immediately. But understand this, Nurse Moore. If this goes wrong, it will be on you." Rachel nodded, her heart racing. She knew the stakes were high, but for the first time she felt a surge of hope. This was it, the moment that would change everything. The next morning, the tension in the hospital was palpable. Rachel walked into the ward early, feeling the weight of the decision that was about to be made. Today would be the day when everything, her career, Claire's future, hung in the balance. Rachel had spent the entire night preparing herself for what was to come. She had reviewed every piece of literature on epiretinal membranes, studied the vitrectomy procedure, and even reached out to colleagues for advice. But nothing could have prepared her for the moment when she would have to stand in front of Claire and explain the risks involved. As she entered room 347, she found Claire sitting on the bed, her hands resting in her lap. She looked calm, but Rachel could see the tension in her shoulders. Her father, General Harrison, stood at the foot of the bed, his eyes scanning the room, his posture as rigid as ever. "Good morning, Claire." "How are you feeling?" Rachel asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Claire looked up at her, her expression unreadable. "I'm fine," she said, her voice flat. But Rachel could hear the underlying uncertainty in her words. Rachel took a deep breath and walked closer. "We're going to re-examine your eyes this morning," she said gently. "Dr. Kellerman will be performing the procedure. It's a big decision, and I know it's not an easy one." Claire nodded, but Rachel could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. "I'm not going to lie to you, Claire," Rachel continued. "The surgery is risky. There are complications, and there's no guarantee it will work. But if we don't act now, we'll never know what could have been. You've lived in darkness for 18 years, but this is your chance to see again." Claire's eyes drifted downward, and for a moment, the room was filled with the quiet hum of the machines around them. Rachel could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on both of them. General Harrison, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. "I want you to know, Claire, that no matter what happens today, you're not alone. We're in this together. But this is your decision. We can't make it for you." Rachel watched as Claire's fingers twitched nervously. The silence stretched on, and for a moment, Rachel thought Claire might refuse. But then Claire raised her head, meeting Rachel's eyes. "Is there a chance it could work?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling slightly. Rachel nodded. "There's a chance. It's not a guarantee, but it's the best chance you've got." Claire's gaze shifted to her father. She seemed to be searching for something in his face, something that might give her the courage to take the leap. After a long moment, she nodded. "Okay," Claire said, her voice steady. "Let's do it." General Harrison let out a slow breath, his expression softening. "You're sure?" Claire gave him a small smile. "I've spent my whole life waiting for something to change. I can't keep waiting forever." Rachel's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and fear. She had known Claire would make this decision, but hearing her say it aloud made it real. This was the moment when everything could change. But it also meant the risk was real. If she was wrong, if something went wrong during the procedure, there would be no going back. "All right," Rachel said, her voice firm now. "We'll go over the risks again, but we'll do this. You're not alone in this, Claire. I'll be here every step of the way." As Rachel turned to leave the room and prepare for the procedure, she glanced back at Claire and her father. General Harrison was holding his daughter's hand, his grip firm, but his eyes were filled with something softer now, something that resembled hope. For the first time in 18 years, he seemed to believe that a change was possible. The room was eerily quiet as the surgical team prepped for the procedure. Claire lay on the operating table, her eyes closed beneath the sterile surgical drapes, the faint hum of machines and soft murmurs of the medical staff filling the space. Rachel stood at the observation window, watching as Dr. Kellerman and his team prepared the instruments. Her heart was in her throat, every muscle tense with anticipation. This was it, the moment that would either restore Claire's sight or shatter the fragile hope they had built over the past few days. General Harrison stood beside her, his face drawn tight with worry. His normally steady demeanor had been replaced with a quiet anxiety as he watched the surgical team move into action. His eyes never left Claire, not for a second. He was holding on to the belief that his daughter would finally be able to see, but he also knew the risks. Rachel's thoughts were a whirlwind. She had done everything she could. She had pushed back against the system, trusted her instincts, and fought for Claire. Now, there was nothing left to do but wait. She turned to General Harrison, offering him a small, reassuring smile. "She's in good hands," Rachel said, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it herself. "I hope so," the general replied quietly, his voice thick with emotion. The surgery began. Claire's body was still, but Rachel could see the tension in her fingers, tightly gripping the edges of the table beneath her. The vitrectomy was delicate work, and doctor. Kellerman's movements were precise, his focus unshakable. Claire's retinas would be exposed, the membranes carefully peeled away. The process was long and painstaking, but Rachel couldn't look away. The stakes were too high. Time seemed to slow as Rachel watched the team work. It felt like hours before Dr. Kellerman finally spoke, his voice carrying over the speaker system. "We're beginning the membrane removal, starting with the right eye." Rachel's heart raced as she heard the procedure unfolding in real time. She glanced at General Harrison, who was standing stiffly by her side. His eyes were fixed on the monitor, watching the surgery unfold through the glass. His jaw clenched, and Rachel could see his fingers tightening into a fist. Minutes dragged on. The surgical team worked with the precision of experts, every movement deliberate. The first membrane was finally removed, and Rachel couldn't help the breath she held in her chest. It was done. The first layer was gone. "There's the first one, Doctor." Kellerman's voice came through again. "We've got it. Moving on to the second membrane now." General Harrison exhaled, but there was no relief in his expression yet. Claire was still unconscious, her eyes closed under the sterile bandages. The real test would come when she woke up, when they could see if the procedure had worked. "Perfect removal," Dr. Kellerman continued, his tone now sounding more confident. "Proceeding with the second eye." Claire's heart rate remained steady, a reassuring sign, but Rachel knew that wouldn't be enough. She needed Claire to wake up and see, to see for the first time in 18 years. The procedure took nearly an hour, each minute stretching into what felt like an eternity. Finally, after what seemed like a lifetime, Dr. Kellerman stepped back, his face hard to read. "It's complete," he said simply. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. It was done. Claire had made it through. But now, the real test awaited. Later, in recovery room. The sterile smell of the recovery room was sharp in the air, a stark contrast to the tension that filled the small space. General Harrison was sitting by Claire's side, his hand still holding hers, his expression filled with hope but also fear. Claire was still unconscious, her face pale, the bandages covering her eyes. Rachel stood near the door, watching them, her hands clasped in front of her. She felt a sense of helplessness creep over her. It wasn't over yet. Not until Claire woke up and opened her eyes. Minutes passed. Then, finally, Claire stirred. Her fingers twitched, and her breathing became a little more shallow. Her eyelids fluttered, as if trying to adjust to the new sensations. Rachel stepped forward, her heart racing in her chest. "Claire," she whispered gently, "can you hear me?" Claire's breath hitched as her eyes slowly opened. For the first time in 18 years, she saw the world beyond her darkness. Her eyes were blurry, unfocused at first, but then slowly they began to adjust. Rachel held her breath, watching, praying for Claire to see something, anything. And then Claire gasped. "It's not dark," she whispered, her voice breaking. I can see light." Rachel felt her own eyes fill with tears. "Aume, it's just the beginning," she said softly. "It'll get clearer." Claire blinked again, and for the first time, she saw the outlines of shapes, the outlines of faces. Her eyes moved slowly, searching, scanning the room. She turned her head, and her gaze locked onto General Harrison. "Dad?" Claire whispered, her voice filled with awe. General Harrison's breath caught in his throat, and without thinking, he rushed to her side. His hand touched her cheek, and his voice broke with emotion. "Claire," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "You can see me." Claire's lips trembled as she reached up, touching his face with trembling fingers. She gasped again, this time in amazement. "I see you," she said softly, her voice full of disbelief. "I see you, Dad." The room seemed to fall silent as father and daughter shared this profound moment of connection. After 18 years, the darkness had been lifted, and Claire could finally see the world around her. And in that moment, General Harrison knew this was the victory he had fought for. Not in a battlefield, but in a hospital room, where a daughter had reclaimed her sight.